There's no bigger waiver wire than this week, so grab your wallet as we spend that fab searching for bargains on the Fantasy First Down. Week one is over, and I hope you've started off with a win. But if not, it's time to improve those teams as we spend some fab looking at the best waiver wire pickups this week. If you haven't already, it would be great if you'd liked and subscribed on YouTube. Our Instagram is at the Fantasy First Down. You can catch us on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And you can also go to my website where all my rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Plus, my streamers and stashes article will be out very soon on football.rasball.com. Today, we're talking waiver wire pickup. So let's get into that. And we're starting off with the quarterbacks. And realistically, I mean, you've probably got your starting quarterback still. But if you had Jordan Love and you need to pick up someone else and you didn't have anyone else on your bench, which hopefully you didn't, then here are four good options. Jared Goff, pretty average against the Rams. Didn't really need to throw that much, but takes on Tampa Bay, which is a good quarterback matchup. He is my favorite, I guess you could say, streamer of this week. Quarterback streamers, most of these guys are going to be available. You can see I've got the ownership percentage there. It says 91% for Jared Goff. I'm using Yahoo. I'm not really buying that. He's definitely available in quite a few of my leagues. Admittedly, we don't pick up a lot of quarterbacks in our leagues. Usually we run with one, so it depends on what league you're in, but he's going to be available in plenty of leagues. And if he's not, Baker Mayfield probably is. He was one of my favorite sleepers among quarterbacks this season, and he panned out in week one. He was the quarterback too, and I do expect that he's going to have to throw a heap against Detroit. We've seen that happen in the past. The secondary tends to be their weakness. They tend to be good at stopping the run, and we have seen that Rashad White has been pretty inefficient in the run game, so I do expect that Baker's going to have to throw a heap again, so I think he's going to be very good for week two. Kirk Cousins is a guy I liked a lot in the preseason, but I was very low on him this week. He was my quarterback 25. I did not think that was going to be a good matchup, but I think this week will be a lot better. The Eagles have conceded the most points against opposing quarterbacks last season. I do think that this is going to be a situation that you can target. Cousins does have a lot of strong weapons. He didn't look great in that first game. I think he bounces back. So he is a guy you can definitely pick up as well. And Matthew Stafford obviously had a good, solid game, throwing for over 300 yards. Losing Puka Nacua isn't ideal, but I still think he's going to be very effective and going to give you solid fantasy values. Now, running backs is really where it's at, and I've kind of broken these into three sections. I've talked about shallow options, so guys you can pick up if you're in a pretty shallow league. Most guys are available, maybe a 10-team league or even an 8-team league, so you're able to pick up guys that aren't available in most leagues. Then I've got some slightly deeper options if you're in more of a standard league and you're fighting for those guys who are available. And then I've also got some super deep options that are going to be available in pretty much every league outside your 32-team leagues. And I'm in a few of those, and even some of these guys are available. But let's start off with the shallow options. And Jerome Ford was the clear number one guy in Cleveland. We kind of knew that was going to happen until Nick Chubb was healthy. He's definitely someone that you can reliably start each week. Donta Foreman did not steal the goal line carries as many supposed. I didn't think that was likely. I had him ranked very low. And of course, Pierre Strong was barely involved. He's just the backup. He gets the Jaguars this week. That's a solid matchup, but realistically, you're bringing him in as a starting option, potentially because you've got an injured player, or alternatively because you've just got some weak options because you went 0 RB. Zach Moss is also a very strong option. He was clearly the number one over Chase Brown. Brown was still certainly involved on early downs, but Moss seemed to be used more across the board. He was certainly used more in the passing game than I think any of us expected. I expect that in another matchup, in a situation where they're not randomly trailing, then I do think Moss is going to be very effective. He's a guy that I would want to have because I think he's essentially their starters. He's taking over that Joe Mixon role. Chase Brown is taking over the Chase Brown role. J.K. Dobbins obviously had a great game. He should be solid as well against Carolina. I think he's going to be very good in week two. How he goes later on this season, we don't know because not every matchup is going to be as good as these first couple. But obviously, he was explosive. He looked clearly the best out of the two backs. The concern here, Does Gus Edwards take the goal line carries? Is he able to have another better week later on? Is this a hot hand situation where you don't know who's going to be starting each week? It's not like Gus Edwards is going anywhere. He's still a reliable back, and he still ultimately had a similar amount of snaps on early down. So I'm not really set on J.K. Dobbins, but certainly is a guy that you can certainly pick up and feel solid about. Certainly someone you're going to be able to start on bye weeks as well. And of course, Jordan Mason is an option. He's really only like a 1 or 2 week guy, which is why I can't really consider him a good option in shallow leagues, but he's going to be available in a lot of deeper leagues as well. He's someone that's great to pick up if you've got Christian McCaffrey. But remember, he's probably only going to be starting for a week or two. It does look like McCaffrey could potentially be out in week 2. We have seen these things drag on a little bit. It is possible he's re-aggravated his injury, be that calf or some other area around there. And that could mean that this does go into the season a little bit more. In that case, you're going to want to have Jordan Mason. He was a guy that I was happy with as a handcuff option going into the season, and he has been taken in a lot of leagues, but there are plenty of leagues out there where he's available. If he's in yours, you certainly got to put a claim in if you're planning on using him, because he is probably going to be a top 10 option many weeks when McCaffrey is out. Now, these are some slightly deeper options, and these are specifically deeper starting options. So these are guys where you really need someone to start this week. You're kind of desperate for whatever reason. You've either have an injury, maybe you've got McCaffrey, potentially you've just got a situation where the guys that you drafted just aren't cutting it. These are some options of guys that you can put in, and they're going to give you maybe some running back 3 numbers, the best case scenario. Rico Dowdle does seem like he's pretty much exactly splitting stats with Ezekiel Elliott, which is probably the best case scenario of what we could expect. The next thing that you hope for is that he slowly, as the season goes on, starts to take over that role. That didn't happen this week. Zeke looked like the better of the 2 options. He scored the touchdown, but that was just a fluke. It was on his drive. But Dowdle didn't look particularly effective. Then again, the whole Cowboys run game didn't look great. It's a tough matchup against Cleveland. I do think that potentially this week against the Saints, it doesn't get a lot better, but I certainly think that long-term he is someone that you're probably going to want to have available if you're struggling for starting options. Jaleel McLaughlin, same idea, definitely struggled. Was used certainly a lot in the receiving game, got 5 targets, which is weird because Javonte Williams is getting more snaps there, but they seem to be checking down to McLaughlin. McLaughlin was getting more early down work, which is kind of the reverse of what we expected. Ultimately, this is some sort of weird committee situation. If you're desperate for a starter, McLaughlin is an option there. He's getting nearly 50% of the snaps and the touches, and that's better than you're going to get most places. He is available in a lot of leagues. Ty Chandler is someone I called my shot on earlier in the season. I knew that he was going to get used plenty, and he did in this game. He and Aaron Jones, it wasn't full on 50-50 split, but Chandler was certainly heavily involved. And we know that Aaron Jones is very injury prone. So Chandler is someone that you can throw out there, get a little bit of production, and then also know if Jones goes down, then he's going to be a reliable starter for you. But he's certainly behind those other 2. Alexander Mattison, I think, has less upside than Chandler, but he's got more usability, possibly than anyone else on this list but maybe not this week against the Ravens. That's not really a good situation. I do think because they're trailing a lot, we will see more of Mattison. He is more of the 3rd down back. That's certainly how he was used in this game. Obviously, had 6 targets and took him for 43 yards. He was used on early downs a little bit, but White was clearly more effective. I think in games where the Raiders are likely to win, you will see a lot of Zamir White. In games where the Raiders are losing, you're probably going to see a bit more Mattison. So that means, he's at least a viable option this week, but I probably want to see it again before really shoving him into my lineup. Having said that, he's better than most of the other guys available as starters for right now. And then some waiver stashes for me with running backs. This is how you should essentially be using the waiver wire most of the time. Should be getting these guys before they blow up. Now, to be fair, Tanks Bigsby is a guy that I've been talking about all offseason. Well, certainly since the preseason games anyway. He was one of my favorites. I was a little bit surprised that he just jumped straight over Deonis Johnson, but to me, he was one of the best handcuff options. I didn't expect him to be used nearly as much as Travis Etienne. In fact, they had the same amount of carries. And Bigsby was significantly better on his carries, although he didn't get the touchdown. Now, that's not why you're picking him up. You're certainly not picking him up to start him. You pick him up in case Travis Etienne has an injury. Then suddenly he's going to be extraordinarily valuable. So you want him on your bench for that reason. And if you're desperate on a bye week, he's certainly an option. Another guy that fits in that exact same category is Bucky Irving. He was absolutely fantastic. Had one of the most efficient debuts we've ever seen. That's according to Nate Yankee. A lot of the stats and stuff I get is off PFF, so shout out to them. You should definitely look at their stuff. Bucky Irving was fantastic in that first game. Look, Rashad White's still the starter, but he's not been very good for a long time. And Irving did look explosive. Having said that, we have seen on small sample sizes, there have been plenty of rookies who've had a couple of good games, and then when given more carries, haven't been able to follow it up. So we'll see how it goes against a very difficult Detroit lineup. It's very hard to run against the Lions. They were one of the best last season. And we saw the Rams. I mean, they were okay against them relatively, but it's certainly not the easiest thing to do. So for that reason, you're not starting Irving this week. Certainly, he's way behind White, but he's a great bench stash. There was a lot of conjecture in the offseason as to whether it was Braylon Allen or Isaiah Davis. There shouldn't have been. To me, Braylon Allen was clearly the top guy. He's one of my favorite late-round guys to pick up during the offseason. And then Isaiah Davis randomly played ahead of him during the preseason in week 2, and then neither was used in week 3, and we didn't know going into the season who was the better handcuff. Well, eventually, Breece Hall came off in the game against the 49ers, and it was Braylon Allen that was involved. And I believe that Allen is the clear backup. He looked good too. Only had a couple of touches, but he looked effective on them. He looked explosive. He made some good cuts and some good moves. I do think that he is everything he was advertised to be, despite that random week 2 situation. So for me, he's someone I want on my benches. I'll be picking him up whenever he's available, and I have a bench spot. Because realistically, if Breece Hall goes down, all of a sudden, Braylon Allen, that's a league winner on your hands. Similar situation with Ray Davis. He did get a few more touches. Realistically, the Bills were in an awkward situation where they were kind of having to pass the ball a relatively high amount, and then they were using plenty of James Cook as well. Ray Davis wasn't really involved in that situation. I think if they get bigger leads, you're going to see more of Ray Davis used during the game, but he's really a handcuff. And you're picking him up as a guy who's going to be very effective if James Cook goes down. Certainly, look, the other 3 guys are going into situations where they could potentially be RB1s. Don't know that Davis quite has that upside, but he's close. So he's another guy that I like stashing from waivers. Let's get into the wide receivers. Brian Thomas Jr. had a great game. Look, realistically, didn't get the targets that we maybe thought he would, but he ran plenty of routes. He got more snaps than Christian Kirk did. Weren't sure exactly how that was going to work out. Certainly, early last season, before the injury to Zay Jones, Christian Kirk was only playing in 11 personnel. And then obviously Jones got injured and Kirk exploded. This season, same things happened. Kirk only playing on 11 personnel. Gabe Davis actually played the most snaps. And then it was Brian Thomas Jr. So when they're playing 12 personnel, and it's probably going to happen a bit more in certain situations, that means you're not going to see as much Christian Kirk. You're going to see a lot more Brian Thomas Jr. You might even see some Gabe Davis. You know, I don't like Gabe Davis. I wouldn't pick him up. But I think Brian Thomas Jr. is probably the best wide receiver option. He's not going to be available in most leagues, but if you're in a shallow league, you will be able to pick him up. And I do think he has more upside than most. Jamison Williams, similar situation, high ownership percentage already, but we saw he exploded. He was the wide receiver 5. He had a fantastic game. That's not going to happen every week. But certainly it could happen this week against the Bucs. So he's a guy that you can pick up. Certainly if he's available on waivers, you should be fighting to pick him up. Keon Coleman, I've been big on all off season. I love this guy. Look, didn't have the greatest debut, but his snap and route counts was really high. He was the number 1 guy realistically, and I signaled that was going to happen. I said it's going to be Coleman on one side, and then it's going to be Matt Collins on the other side, and you're going to see Khalil Shakir in the slot. Now, as it turned out, Curtis Samuel was healthy, and he took some snaps away from Shakir in the slot. He also appeared on the outside a little bit. Plus, there was a little bit of Marquez Valdez-Scantling popping in for Coleman. I think as the season goes on, we're going to see Coleman turn into an every down player. I think Shakir is going to have to keep fighting off Curtis Samuel. Keon Coleman's the guy to own in this offense. I think he's going to have better games, and I think it might start against Miami. Ladd McConkey had a good, solid debut. Again, not available in most leagues, but there are going to be leagues out there. If you're in them, look, certainly is an option for you to pick up, especially a good PPR option. We saw how good New Orleans did against Carolina, but it was mostly the running backs because they didn't really need to throw the ball a lot. Look, he might produce next week, but realistically, you're picking him up more as like a bench option and seeing how he goes. He's not my favorite of these guys, but certainly he's going to produce. He's probably the number 1 passing option in that game. Now, some slightly deeper options. These guys are all available in at least 60%. At least 40% of leagues they're available. Most are available in over half. And I need to include Rashid Shaheed here. To me, still below those other guys. He is the wide receiver 2 here. He just had one really big play, but he's at least being used as their wide receiver 2. I think we kind of saw that happening. It's kind of a similar situation, I guess, to Jamison Williams in Detroit, where their number 2 really isn't used a lot, but he is still the number 2 option in an NFL offense, and he should be on rosters. And Shaheed doesn't have the talent of a Jamison Williams, but we can see he certainly he's a clear number 2, and he's getting used and he's getting the snap count. They ran the ball a heap, but in games where they're passing more, he could be very productive. So he's someone that you could reliably pick up in a deeper league. Same deal with Brandon Cooks, the number 2 on the Cowboys offense. He was actually used quite a lot, but they were forced to pass the ball a lot. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to happen in the future. But he is certainly another solid option to pick up. And certainly there's an argument that he should be ahead of Shaheed. I just feel like Shaheed maybe has a little bit more upside because Cooks is always going to be behind Lamb unless Lamb gets injured. Demarcus Robinson, to me, I think he probably has the most upside of all these guys on a weekly basis. I think Shaheed and Cooks are going to have some real dud weeks, but I think Robinson's going to be consistently pretty good. He was solid during the latter half of last season when he took over that number 3 role. Even when Kupp wasn't injured and you had both Nakua and Kupp playing, Robinson was getting a lot of touchdown looks. I do feel like there's plenty of upside there with Demarcus Robinson. I really like the idea of picking him up. In many leagues, I'll take him over Shaheed and Cooks simply because I do feel like he's going to be a guy that you can plug in and feel a bit safer about him. But Shaheed and Cooks can certainly develop into a clearer every down role. I don't think Robinson's ever going past Kupp and Nakua. Of course, Nakua looks like he's probably going to spend a good month or more out, and that certainly opens things up for Demarcus Robinson. The number 3 was surprisingly not Tutu Atwell, who sat out for much of the offseason, which usually means you're a starter for the Rams. It's actually Tyler Johnson, which I did not see coming at all. I don't know if that's just a role situation, if he's better suited to the Nakua role, and then they're slowly going to get Atwell involved there. Not entirely sure. We have seen them do things that way before, but he's not a bad super deep waiver option as well. I just don't feel as secure about what his role looks like. Elijah Moore's the number 4 there. Surprisingly, he played ahead of Jerry Jeudy and played in the slot ahead of Jerry Jeudy for the most part as well, which is a bit of a surprise. Look, 71 snaps, 52 routes is high. Now, to be fair, Cleveland did play a lot of snaps in this game, but he was playing clearly ahead of Jeudy. Now, that may shift as the season goes on, but he's a guy you can pick up and speculate on and see what happens because he's available in 2% of leagues, and I like him better than the super deep options. So I battled with this one because Elijah Moore's a solid option. I think Josh Reynolds is a really good option as well. I do think potentially that Bo Nix may be forced to pass the ball a lot because I think they could be trailing a lot, and I think you could argue that Josh Reynolds is a guy you should pick up. The problem is, I think potentially as the season goes on, they start to wonder what they've got in Troy Franklin. They start to wonder what they've got in Marvin Mims. And you do see the veterans in Josh Reynolds start to drift away. But he was clearly the number 2 option here. Had 8 targets, which is fantastic. They did pass the ball a lot to their wide receivers. I think Cortland Sutton had like 11 targets. And Vele as well had 8 targets too. And he's certainly a guy you can pick up. He's going to be available in pretty much every league as well, outside really deep dynasty leagues. So Vele is a guy you can possibly pick up if you don't like any of these guys. Do you really want the Denver wide receivers, though? I don't know. It's hard to feel great about that. But if we're talking about super deep pickups, I do feel like Reynolds is a guy that you will reliably be able to start in deeper, maybe 14 and 16 team leagues. Wan'Dale Robinson's another guy that I was really high on this week. He was one of my favorite streamers. I talked about that on the slot versus wide analysis show for Rasball. I talked about how much I like Wan'Dale Robinson this week, and it panned out. He had like 12 targets. Now, to be fair, he didn't turn it into much, but he certainly was the focal point of this offense. As Malik Neighbors is always getting double coverage, it is possible that continues, and Robinson's going to be a solid option. He takes on Washington this week. So if you really need a streamer, he's once again a viable option. The problem is he's only playing in 11 personnel, so that does limit how things are going to work for him. But look, Daniel Jones clearly likes him, and he's targeting him when he's available, so he is an option for you. Luke McCaffrey, I'm not sure about that. He is their wide receiver 3, but they did cycle those guys a lot. We still saw a lot of Olamide Zaccheaus. We saw a lot of De'Ami Brown eventually as the game went on. But I feel like McCaffrey's kind of locked into that slot role. Again, mostly just playing in 11 personnel, so that kind of caps his upside a little bit. So I don't feel particularly excited about him, but he could develop in their number 2 option, kind of like Jahan Dotson did last year. Not that you really wanted Jahan Dotson last year, but he's kind of going into that role. Jalen McMillan is the number 3 guy with the Bucs. We kind of thought he would be over Trey Palmer, and it's turned out that way. Had that one big touchdown, but I mean, it's hard to get too excited about that. I guess he's just the number 3 option, but we haven't seen the number 3 option for the Bucs be particularly productive for a long time. I don't really see a reason why he would be now, but if you're in a super deep league, he is a viable option to you. Let's talk about tight ends, and this is where the money is. Firstly, because we've had some tight end injuries and a lot of tight ends struggling, so you might want to try some different people. I think if you've got Jake Ferguson, you probably want somebody on your bench, but you're not going to spend as much fab. Looks like David Njoku is going to be out for well over a month. We don't know, but it does look like it's probably a high ankle sprain, and for that reason, you definitely need someone to cover for him. If you've been relying on someone like a Cole Kmet, then you should have listened to me in the preseason because we knew that was coming. Gerald Everett is ahead of him. If you've got someone like Pat Frymouth, you should have listened to me in the preseason because we knew that was coming because I talked a lot about Arthur Smith and how he's not going to use Frymouth enough. You should be picking up one of these guys. I wouldn't necessarily be dropping Frymouth, but I'd be dropping the others. Isaiah Likely, there's nothing to be said here. He was the tight end one. He was targeted heaps. I don't think this will necessarily continue in the same way. I think you're going to see a lot of him and Andrews. They're basically just going to make 12 personnel their base package. And you're going to see two tight ends out there a lot. I think Andrews is going to have better days. Certainly can't drop him, but Likely does seem like a big pickup. You can really spend up on him if you're weak at tight end. Having said that, just because your tight end had one bad week, if he's still a good player, don't panic. You don't need to go out and get another tight end. If you've got one of those top 8 guys, you don't necessarily need to get Likely, but I do think he's someone that you should be getting if you don't have one of those elite options. Jordan Akins is a guy I really like because he played every single snap once David Njoku was out. And that says good things about Njoku too, because Njoku was pretty much on the field the whole time before that. Once Njoku's back, he's still a solid option. I wouldn't be dropping him. If you've got an IR spot and someone does, I'd pick him up and slot him in there. Even if you don't, he's still a viable option. I think he's going to be good once he's back. But realistically, Jordan Akins is taking over that role. He's a talented player. I think he's one of the best backups in the league, and he's going into a role where he's not necessarily playing every down because they're going to bring in someone else like, say, Mitchell Patton or someone like that. But he is going to be the main guy, and I feel like we've seen in this offense that they do use the tight end. After all, he only played about half the game, and he got 4 targets. And that was in an awkward situation against the Cowboys when they weren't playing very well in a game where they're at least in a good battle. I could see Akins getting a lot of targets. So he's someone that I'm happy to pick up. Colby Parkinson is more of a season-long option. Akins is really only going to help you for a month or so, maybe. Parkinson's going to help you all season. Look at that snap count. They only played like 72 snaps. He's out there nearly every single time. We saw a little bit of 12 personnel with Davis Allen and with Hunter Long, but realistically, it's all Colby Parkinson. And he looks solid. Look, that's like the 3rd most yards of every tight end in the league or something like that. And he's free in most leagues. I did actually talk about him going into week 1. He was a guy that I wanted to stash on my bench in a lot of leagues, and I did. I would recommend picking him up now, arguably ahead of Akins if you want a guy for the whole season, not just for the next few weeks. Tucker Kraft is the last guy there. It's hard to feel good about him with Jordan Love being injured, but if you're thinking season long, he's clearly taken over from Luke Musgrave. I had 64 snaps. Musgrave had 17, I believe, off the top of my head. I know he didn't turn it into much, admittedly, and Musgrave did get targeted on a lot of his snaps, and that makes it hard to feel good about Kraft, but he could ultimately develop into just the every down tight end. And we've seen that can have some value here, but realistically, he ends up in that same category as guys like Cade Otton, who arguably could be on this list because his ownership percentage is quite low, where there's kind of limited upside there. I just feel like with Kraft, there's a little bit more because this offense could be very good once Love is back. But I think you could arguably go and get a Cade Otton, for example, and you could feel pretty good about that as well. And no offense, another guy that I considered putting on here was just owned in quite a few more leagues. I figured, why would you be going and getting Fant when you can get Parkinson, who's near certainly going to already be available and you're not going to have to battle for him? But it does seem like Fant's going to be the every down tight end as well. He's a solid option. Kickers. Let's talk streamers, essentially. Look, these are my favorite kickers for this week. It's kind of hard to do kickers this early in the week, but this is my best guess for who's going to be ranked highest. I think Dicker against Carolina. Look, they're probably going to score a lot of points, and he's going to have a pretty safe floor. They're going to stall on a whole heap of drives, I suspect. So I think Dick is the best option. Chris Boswell, 6 field goals last week. Absolutely ridiculous. Now he takes on Denver. I feel like that could be another field goal-a-thon. Jason Myers against New England, another situation where I feel like Seattle might stall quite a bit, but still get enough going to make Myers busy. Plus, he's an accurate kicker. Greg Zuerlein against Tennessee, barely used against San Fran, unsurprisingly. Tennessee is one of the best kicker matchups in the league last season. I think they might have been the best, in fact. I do think that the Jets will be in that and potentially ahead. The Tennessee defense is pretty good, but I do think we're going to get in a lot of situations where they go for field goals, and Zuerlein is pretty accurate. Now, DSTs, again, ownership percentage is a bit dodgy on DSTs and kickers on Yahoo, but I've done my best to kind of honor that as well as I could. Obviously, Chargers against Carolina. The Chargers DST isn't great in general, but against the Panthers, who looked absolutely awful, you've got to feel pretty good about them. Colts against Green Bay. Obviously, Malik Willis is near certainly starting. That means all of a sudden the Colts become an option. They've got a solid defense. I think they're going to be a good option this week. Texans against Chicago. We saw that Caleb Williams really struggled to move the ball. It was really the Bears defense that did a lot of the hard work, did a lot of the scoring, or at least turnovers to get them into scoring positions. And then the run game, I do think that the Texans could be productive. Certainly, if you're in a league where a lot of your points come from the amount of points conceded, I do feel like the Texans are a valuable pickup. And finally, the Seahawks against New England. We saw they were solid this week. Hope for a little bit better against the Broncos, but they still did a solid job. And I think New England, it's once again a really solid matchup. I think they're a team that you can definitely pick up and use. And that's all we've got for the Waiver Wire Show as we head into all of our Week 2 content. I'll be back in the coming days, but make sure, as always, you check out all of our other content. You can obviously find me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our rankings will be up pretty soon at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Obviously, please like and subscribe on YouTube if you don't mind. And finally, you can check out my articles at football.rasball.com. I will have a streamers and stashes articles out soon. And then I'll have my wide receiver article where I go through the slot versus wide analysis and talk about all the best wide receiver matchups this week. That'll come out around Friday or so. But the streamers and stashes should be out by Wednesday or so. I look forward to seeing you guys in the coming days. Hope you enjoyed your first week of football, and I'll see you soon.